My son's in-laws had no idea I spoke Greek, and for 3 hours at that dinner table, I sat perfectly still and let them keep talking. I almost didn't go that night. My son Daniel had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of call where I could hear him choosing his words carefully before he even said hello. He told me that his wife Helena's parents were visiting from Athens, that they were going to have a family dinner at his house on Saturday, and that Helena had suggested it might be nice if I came. She suggested it? I asked. We both want you there, Mom, he said. But there was something careful in his voice, something rehearsed. I said yes anyway. He was my only son, and Helena was a good woman, sharp, hardworking, devoted to Daniel in ways that mattered. I had no complaints about my daughter-in-law. It was her parents I had never quite figured out. I had met them twice before. Once at the wedding, 4 years ago, and once when they visited for the birth of my granddaughter, Lily. Both times, Helena's mother. I'll call her the mother-in-law, because that's what she was to Helena, though to me she was always just a polite stranger, had been warm on the surface and cool underneath. The kind of warm that doesn't quite reach the handshake. Her husband, Helena's father, was quieter, a retired architect, distinguished-looking, with the sort of silence that could mean wisdom or simply a preference for not engaging with people he considered beneath his notice. I was never entirely sure which it was with me. What I should tell you, what matters for everything that comes after, is something I had never mentioned to Daniel's in-laws, because it had simply never come up. For 11 years, starting when I was 26 and newly divorced from Daniel's father, I had lived in a small coastal town in southern Greece. I had gone there originally to teach English at a language school, thinking I would stay for 1 year, maybe 2. I stayed for 11. I learned Greek not from a textbook, but from the woman downstairs who sold olives at the market, from the pharmacist who had no patience for hand gestures, from the priest who ran the community literacy program where I volunteered on Wednesday evenings. By the time I came home to the States, when Daniel was finishing high school and I felt the pull of being close to him again, I spoke Greek the way you speak a language you have dreamed in, not perfectly, but honestly. I had never hidden this from Daniel. He knew. He'd visited me twice in Greece as a child, had a vague memory of the smell of the sea and a blue-painted door, but it wasn't something I talked about often, and when Daniel and Helena got together, the subject simply never arose naturally. Helena's parents never asked where I had lived or what I had done in my younger years. People rarely ask that about women my age. They assume the story isn't interesting. That assumption was about to cost them. I arrived at Daniel's house at 6:30 on Saturday. It was October, and the evenings had gone cold quickly that year. I wore a green cardigan my daughter-in-law had given me the previous Christmas and carried a bottle of wine I'd picked out carefully, a Greek white as it happened, though I told myself that was coincidence. Helena answered the door with Lily on her hip, and my granddaughter reached for me immediately, which did more for my spirits than anything else could have. 3 years old and already so certain about who she loved. I envied her that certainty. Helena's parents were already in the living room. Her mother stood when I entered, embraced me with the two-cheek kiss that was her standard greeting, and said something warm and English and entirely correct. Her father shook my hand and smiled. Everything was proper. Everything was fine. We sat down to dinner around 7:30. Helena had made a lamb dish that her mother had apparently taught her years ago, and it was extraordinary, slow-cooked, with lemon and oregano, the kind of food that makes a table feel like a safe place. Lily was put to bed at 8, and after that the adults settled into the rhythm of a long dinner. Wine was poured. Conversation moved through the usual channels. Daniel's work, Helena's new position at the hospital where she managed a department, the neighborhood, the plans they had to renovate the back porch in the spring. It was during the second bottle of wine that Helena's mother switched to Greek. It wasn't unusual. I understood that. When you have a language that is fully yours, that carries the weight of everything you know how to feel, you reach for it when the evening gets comfortable. Her husband joined her naturally, and Helena followed. Her Greek was beautiful, lyrical, the kind you learn at a mother's knee. Daniel smiled along without understanding, the way good-natured people do when they're surrounded by a language that isn't theirs. And I poured myself more water and looked at my plate and listened. At first, it was nothing. Catching up, a cousin's new apartment in Thessaloniki, some disagreement about a shared property, a neighbor who had done something mildly scandalous. I let it wash over me. I was not trying to gather information. I was simply sitting at a table where people had forgotten I was a person who could understand them. Then Helena's mother said something that made me set down my fork very quietly. She was talking about Daniel. She said, and I am translating as accurately as I can, that she had been watching him all evening and she still wasn't sure he was serious enough for the life Helena deserved. She said that Helena had always had a tendency to be loyal to people past the point of good judgment, and that this was a beautiful quality, but also a dangerous one. She said she worried that Daniel was comfortable in a way that would eventually become complacency. I looked at my son. He was smiling, reaching for the breadbasket, entirely unaware. Helena, to her credit, pushed back, in Greek, quietly, the way a daughter argues with a mother at a dinner table when she doesn't want to make a scene. She said that Daniel was a good man and a good father, and that she had never once questioned her choice. Her mother made a sound that was not quite disagreement and not quite acceptance. Her father, who had been quiet for most of the dinner, said something then that I felt like a change in the room's temperature. He said that Helena's mother wasn't talking about love. Of course, Daniel loved Helena. That wasn't the question. The question was whether Helena's family in Athens could continue to support the plan they had been discussing, the investment, the property, the future arrangement they had apparently been considering for some time, if they were not fully confident in Daniel's steadiness. He said the word for reliable in a way that made it sound like a verdict rather than a description. There was an investment, a significant one, it seemed, something Daniel and Helena had been working toward, something tied to property in Greece that Helena's family had been prepared to help fund. And in the space of about 4 minutes, at my son's dinner table, while my son smiled and reached for the bread, his in-laws had quietly decided he didn't deserve it. I breathed. I looked at my wine glass. I thought about the 11 years I had spent in a country that had taught me how to sit with discomfort and not flinch. And then I thought about my son. I want to be clear that what I felt wasn't rage. It was something colder and more deliberate than rage. It was the feeling of a decision being made. I waited until there was a natural pause. Helena's mother had just finished a sentence about practicalities, something logistical, and her husband had nodded and reached for his wine. The table was momentarily quiet. I looked at Helena's mother, and I spoke in Greek. I said, slowly, clearly, in the southern coastal accent I had learned from all sellers and pharmacists, and a patient priest, that I understood why she had concerns, that it was natural for a mother to look carefully at the man her daughter had chosen, that I had done the same thing when Daniel first brought Helena home, and I would do it again, because that was what mothers did. The silence at the table was total. Helena's hand stopped moving. Her father put down his wine glass. I continued. I said that I had been sitting at this table for 3 hours, listening, and what I had heard was a woman who loved her daughter very much and was frightened, and I understood that fear. I had raised a child alone in a country far from home, and fear had been my constant companion for most of those years. But I had also learned, in Greece, as it happened in a small town on the southern coast where I'd lived for 11 years before coming home, that fear made a poor business partner and an even worse judge of character. I said that my son was not flashy, and he was not loud, and he would never perform for an audience to prove his worth. But he had been faithful to Helena for 7 years, had sat beside her through a pregnancy that frightened both of them, had reorganized his entire career to accommodate her schedule when Lily was born, and had never once, not once, asked for recognition for any of it. I said that in my experience, that was not complacency. That was the kind of steadiness that was very easy to miss if you were looking for the wrong thing. Helena's mother stared at me. Her husband said in Greek, very carefully, how long had I spoken Greek? I said that I had spoken it for about 40 years and that I had lived in a town called Cordomiley for 11 of them, and that I had been the English teacher at the school on the corner of the main road, which had since become a ceramic studio, or had the last time I visited. Helena made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. Her mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, in Greek, that she owed me an apology. I told her she owed the apology to Daniel. She turned to my son then, in English, slowly, as though choosing each word with particular care, and she said that she had been speaking unfairly about him this evening, and that she had been wrong to do so. She said that from what she could see, he had his mother's character, and that she meant that as the highest compliment she could offer. Daniel looked at me, then he looked at his mother-in-law, then back at me. "Mom," he said, "what just happened?" Helena laughed first. A real laugh, sudden and full, the kind that breaks a room open. Her father smiled slowly, like a door that had been stuck finally coming loose from its frame. Even Helena's mother, after a moment, allowed herself something that started as a press of the lips and became, gradually, a real smile. I told Daniel I would explain later. What I explained later was this. We were standing in the kitchen after her parents had said good night and gone upstairs to the guest room. Daniel was washing the good wine glasses by hand the way I taught him when he was a teenager, and I was drying them, and Lily was asleep down the hall, and Helena was sitting at the kitchen table with the particular exhaustion of someone who has just survived something. I told him about Greece. Not the version I had always told, the summary, the highlights, the picturesque details, the real version. The loneliness of the first winter. The way the language had felt like a wall, and then a window, and then finally a home. The friends I had made, some of whom I still wrote to. The life I had built there that was entirely my own before I came back to be close to him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I never knew it was that long, or that it mattered that much to you." I told him I hadn't talked about it because I hadn't wanted him to feel like there was a version of me that existed before him, somewhere far away, that he didn't have access to. I had come home because he was where my real life was, but I was also glad I had gone. I was glad I had been young and frightened and determined enough to build something in a language that wasn't mine. He handed me a wine glass, and I dried it. "You could have said something earlier tonight," he said, "like at the start of dinner." "I know," I told him. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. Outside the kitchen window, the October dark was complete, and somewhere down the block a neighbor's dog was barking at something invisible. Because I wanted to understand what I was actually dealing with before I said anything, I said. And because timing matters. Your grandmother used to say that a well-placed word is worth 10 frantic ones. He smiled. She was a woman who would have gotten along with Helena's father. I think so too. Helena looked up from the table. She said she was sorry. Not for her parents exactly. She couldn't control her parents. But for the situation, for the discomfort, for the fact that I had to experience that. I sat down across from her and I told her there was nothing to apologize for. I told her that the people who love us most are sometimes the ones who frighten us into bad decisions, and that her mother's fear came from the same place as my own. From loving her daughter so much that the prospect of her being unhappy was simply unbearable. That didn't excuse it, but it made it human. Helena reached across the table and held my hand for a moment without saying anything. That, I think, was the moment we actually became family. Not at the wedding, not when Lily was born. Here, in a kitchen at 10:30 at night, with the good glasses drying on the counter, and the remains of a lamb dinner in the refrigerator, and a dog still barking somewhere in the dark. The investment did go through eventually. Helena's parents came to visit again in the spring, and her father and I had a long conversation about the architecture of the town where I had lived, which he knew well, had in fact considered working there once, many years ago, a plan that had never materialized. There was something in that, in the way people's paths nearly intersect without knowing it, that I found quietly moving. Her mother and I were not destined to be close. We were too different for that, and too alike in the ways that made closeness complicated. But we understood each other. And at that kitchen table in October, I think she'd understood something she hadn't before, that her daughter's family was larger and stranger and more resourceful than she had assumed, that the quiet woman in the green cardigan at the end of the table had been somewhere, had done something, had known grief and loneliness and hard work in a language that wasn't her native one, and had come out of it with something she didn't advertise but hadn't lost. My son called me the following week. He had a habit from childhood of calling when he was on his way home from work. Not to say anything in particular, just to talk. I loved those calls. I still love them. He said, "I've been thinking about something you said, about building something in a language that wasn't yours." "What about it?" "I want to try to learn some Greek," he said. "Not fluently or anything, just enough to talk to Lily about it someday, so she knows where part of her family comes from." I was quiet for a moment. "I can help with that," I said. "I know you can," he said. "That's why I'm asking." I had learned in the years since coming home that the most important things about a person are usually the quiet ones, not the accomplishments you put on a resume or the stories you tell at parties, the languages you learn in ordinary kitchens, the steadiness you build in places no one thought to look, the way you wait, sometimes, until the exactly right moment to say what you have always known. I have a photograph from that October dinner. Helena took it without any of us noticing. Me and her father and her mother, the three of us talking at the table, the remains of the lamb between us, something genuine happening in the space between our faces. You wouldn't know looking at it what had been said an hour before. You would just see three older people at a table having the kind of conversation that looks from the outside exactly like understanding. That is, I suppose, what it was.